So I am really thrilled to be able to introduce to you our presenter, Garrick Caldwell. He's actually been a hospice volunteer since 1987, serving on an on-call hospital and hospice chaplain. He's a Respecting Choices Advanced Care Planning Certified Instructor and Facilitator. And as a certified grief recovery specialist, he co-created with Hospice Austin Conversations on Grief, a monthly online grief support group. Garrick holds a certificate in death and grief studies from the Center for Loss and Transitions. He and his late wife, Kinslow, along with 20 Austin area healthcare advocates, co-created Kitchen Table Conversations. It's an all-volunteer nonprofit providing educational resources that empower people to have end-of-life conversations. Kinslow died February 12, 2019. Garrick was a full-time caregiver and end-of-life companion. Currently, he's studying to become an end-of-life certified care doula. So I'm Jennifer Prescott. I'm one of the board members, and I want to welcome everyone that's here and welcome Garrick as well, who's going to be presenting today and talking about expected loss, coping with anticipatory grief. I know we have some other folks on the call as well. I did want to make an announcement. Our next meeting, which is going to be the third Saturday of August, is actually going to be Hope Young is going to be speaking on music therapy. And I believe it's from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. and we'll have more information to come. I want to thank everyone that's here, especially thanking everyone from the board, those of you that are care partners and people with Parkinson's. Mary, thank you so much for all that you do. We are thrilled that Garrett Colwell is going to speak to us today. Garrett, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much for asking me to be here. It's an honor to come together and have a conversation about grief. In this particular type of grief, anticipatory grief, early grief is oftentimes it can be referred to as well, is something we don't talk a lot about, but it's something that happens and something we experience on a very regular basis. So it has to do with expected loss, and it's called anticipatory grief. And we're going to dive into the topic and different aspects of it, how to deal with it, how to understand what it is. We're going to talk about grief and mourning and a number of things that have to do with just getting us more aware of how grief and mourning work in our lives, particularly anticipatory grief. So what I'd like to do is do this kind of like as a conversation. I mean, the nonprofit we created several years ago is called Kitchen Table Conversations. And the intent was to invite people to have a conversation, you know, kind of relax, get your favorite beverage, find a comfortable place at the table, and just be able to have a space in which you can talk about things that are on your mind and in your heart. And so that's what I'd like to invite you to think about, that what we're doing is we're just sitting around the kitchen table having a conversation. So that means that you're welcome to take in the chat and let us know what it is that you are thinking or feeling. And certainly at any point in time, you get a chance to have a thought or a question or a concern or a story that you want to share that exemplifies a point or you want further exploration around, then please just simply, jump in, ask the question, and we'll be able to stop and take a look and make sure that we take time to honor and respect what it is that you have as a concern or a question, something that you'd like to explore. So let's begin by just kind of taking a deep breath and bringing our attention to this moment. Being present to what we're about to talk about. We'll be together here for the next 55 minutes or so. And so just let the day be the day and let us be present here with one another. And start off with a question of you, which is, what would you like to learn today? In other words, what brought you here to this particular point in time where you felt this was a good idea to spend your time talking about anticipatory grief? And what is it that you want to learn about it, or how is it coming up in your life right now? And again, you can put this in the chat if you prefer not to come on camera, but if you are, is everyone able to mute or unmute themselves, Jennifer?
Yeah, you should be able to. I'll just start as a caregiver. as a nurse that provides care for many people in our community that are going to expect loss, I'd like to get out of this how to support someone that is anticipating, a great sense of loss, and what are some things that I can do to help to support them.
And you're talking about the caregiver, from one caregiver to another, or the
Mm-hmm.
grief that the person who's dying is going through?
Sure, it's really for the family. So, I mean, for me, it's easier to support the person, maybe at an end of life situation. I'm a nurse, I know how to do that. But, what are some things that, even if it's a friend, that how do you support someone who's anticipating the loss of someone?
Right. Okay. Good.
And I'd like to actually add to that a little bit, being a caregiver myself, not only for, people with CAPS, but I mean, for me personally with my mother, kind of with what Jennifer was talking about for a friend or something like that, not having the medical background, but knowing as far as like certified or anything, but having that conversation maybe as expecting of an older adult, my mother in this case, and having a large family and being able to kind of deal with them, as well as just, getting that knowledge of opening up that conversation of mom wants or mom needs, or we as a family need to, those type of things. Because when you have a lot of people involved, it does get messy.
Yeah. So understanding what mom's wishes are and having that conversation with her to invite her into that conversation over the course of the time you have with her.
Yes. And opening up that dialogue with family members who may think they know her better.
Oh, I see. And so how to navigate, mitigate, negotiate.
How to navigate, yeah. And that may be another type conversation, maybe in the next one, but also knowing that she does have dementia issues that can sometimes, and expecting that, and how, because of what today's topic is. Yeah.
Also, she does have dementia. Where and what stage is she in now?
It comes and goes. It comes and goes.
Mild.
Yeah. I would say we're in the middle of it. Yeah, I would say we're in the middle of it. Seems to be progressing.
Yeah.
So hard. It's hard.
All right. Thank you, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Jeannie?
Yes.
What are your thoughts? What would you like to learn today?
Well, my husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago now, and we're still navigating the day by day, trying to get it all figured out. I think I've put my my thoughts of grief and what I'll be going through if he passes before me. I put that on hold for quite some time because we're just still dealing with the day-to-day goals and frustrations.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't even really thought about that, but it's a topic that, we've been through other types of grief and never one like this before, where we know it's inevitable.
Thanks, Jeannie.
Mhm.
Is it Manisha? Is that how you say your name?
Yes, it is. Are you able to hear me?
We sure can.
So I missed the question, but is everybody just sharing a little bit about what they want to get out of the session today? Okay. My sister is here also, and our mother is diagnosed with a variety of atypical Parkinsonism and has actually outlasted sort of the typical prognosis and so forth. And in the family, we are planning things like, a life appreciation and not like a typical life celebration, just something we would do anyway, because nobody really knows what's going to happen. But I guess this topic is timely for us, and we have been on this road for a number of years, but the progression has been rapid, a lot more rapid than like a typical PD diagnosis. So it's like I think Jeannie was saying, it's a lot to grapple with in the day-to-day, and the things, the events that change the baseline happen relatively rapidly. But mom is actually still aware and cognizant, and if she's not in pain, she even exhibits a sense of humor. And so we're just very interested in knowing how we cannot get lost in the anticipation and be where we are. At least that's what I'm interested in. I cannot speak for my sister. So
it's interesting that you say lost in the anticipation. It's very, very telling of what, and a very great way to kind of summarize and kind of put some attention on the fact that we can get lost in the anticipation, that we really can. We can future project, we can catastrophize, we can put ourselves in a place that we're not here. And part of that is trying to figure out the future, because our mind loves to be in control. It hates being helpless and fearful. It wants to be in control, so it just projects into the future, and all of a sudden now we're there, not here, and we're missing the preciousness of now.
mm-hmm.
It's normal, it's natural, but it's also one of those things that mindfulness and attention to the moment to moment, where it becomes so important, is really, this is now. And how do you bring your attention back to the present when you're in that place where you're in the future? And there's nothing wrong. Your imagination can go wild, but it can also get out of hand and put you there more than you're here. Part of it's self-protection, of course, and part of it, of course, is that you really would like to have more control over what you don't have control over, which you don't have control over anyway.
Yes. And I think, what Jeannie was saying also in that day-to-day, I also think there's, separate from an anticipatory grief, which seems to be associated with the person passing on from their body, is what is the actual grief that we may be facing right now, where the person, I think there was another woman who was talking about her mother having dementia. So there's something that we're anticipating, but there's actually something that we've been through that we haven't even had time to really grapple with, it, what has actually happened already, and that loss that we might be experiencing because we are so busy keeping up. So I think that's a corollary to that. So those are the things that interest me.
Keep me on task. So these are incredible. So let's not make sure that if we get too far along that we don't miss particularly the part about the day-to-day. That's a really important piece of this. So thank you.
Thank you.
And this is your sister?
I don't know if her face is showing, but she is there.
I did just take myself off of, I just turned on my video, and hi, I'm Nana Shahani. I actually wrote in the chat, and I didn't know the term anticipatory grief until my sister sent the CAPS newsletter to me and my dad, and I was very interested in it. I think that I've been experiencing it in some way over the last couple of years. So I'm just interested in, I went to the Kitchen Table Conversations site from that newsletter, and I'm, we're having, dialogue within the family, and I'm just interested in hearing about this, and I don't have specific questions, but hearing what other people have to share is sometimes helpful.
Yeah. And they may come up along the way as we go. The questions will just start flowing. So there's just jump in and ask the question. Don't be shy. And
sure.
We're just sitting around.
Sometimes there are people who don't look at the sign on my door that says I'm in a meeting.
Right.
So.
I understand.
I
understand. John or Ann, do you want to comment and share with us what it is you'd like to learn today before we dive into the
Sure. I'm a CAPS board member, but I'm also a financial planner and I focus on retirement planning. So folks coming into or enjoying retirement, hopefully. And we had our first client come on. They're in their 60s, but she has Parkinson's, like early days. And it's kind of one of those things where this is the first time I'm dealing with that with a client, but I can't imagine it's going to be the last. So I think grappling with the emotions of financial planning and thinking about that kind of thing is as important as grappling with the numbers and the dollars and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really interested to sort of just learn more about what I can anticipate the clients are thinking about and feeling. So I think that helps me just engage with them.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you, John. Anne? Okay, so maybe Anne stepped away. We'll catch up with her in a moment. What we're going to talk about today is based upon a book that was written by one of my mentors, Dr. Alan Wolfeld, and the book is entitled, the title of this talk, which is Expecting Loss, Coping with Anticipatory Grief. It's about 50 pages or so. Dr. Wolfeld is a 40 years of private practice, written over 80 books on the topic. And this particular book was one of the books that he was encouraged by myself and a number of other people to write, because it's one of those topics that we don't talk much about. And it's an important topic to talk about because it's very real. It's something we deal with in everyday life, even though we're not facing necessarily the loss of a loved one. But anticipatory grief, expected loss, is all part and parcel of how we live a life and in day to day. So I just want to give you a point of reference here, that this book, and you can order it from the Center for Loss and Life Transition, or the centerforloss.com. And it's really a fantastic book. It's really power packed. We're not going to obviously cover all the material that's in the book. We're going to highlight it. And I offer you an opportunity, if you like what we talked about today, that we could get together at some point in the future and actually just dive deeper into the book itself, so that you'd be able to have a more in-depth understanding of what he's talking about in the context of this. Very little has been written about anticipatory grief. There's some articles I'll refer to and give you links to, so that you can go ahead and, if you want to, you can, find your way to, you can find your way to these articles in the future as we go. But, and this here is the link in the chat box to the book. So let's start first of all by understanding what grief is, because one of those things that we don't talk about either. Grief is not something we as a society go around and say, hey, let's talk about grief. Let's talk about being sad. We only want to talk about what's happy, what makes sense, what makes us happy. And we're always talking about that. We don't want to talk about sadness. Sadness is one of those things that's lost its place in our vocabulary, but it's a very integral part of life. It's one of those things that you can do all you want to do to deny it, but it's nonetheless present. So it's better to be aware of it, understand what it is, what place it does have, what role it does play in our day-to-day life, particularly when we're talking about grief and mourning. And so we're going to talk about the fact that it's important to understand. So I come to this work as a result of my late wife, Kinslow, who you can see her picture up here behind me. She and I married on the 1st of November 2014. 22 days later, she received a diagnosis of stage 4 metastatic melanoma. For the next 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks, we spent that time, our entire married life, together, keeping her alive as long as possible, which is exactly how she wanted to live her life. And so she died in my arms on February 12th of 2019, a little over 2 years ago. So I can share with you this experience as we weave into this, the context of and the content that we're talking about that's coming from the book about what anticipatory grief is, because I certainly have lived through it, as you are living through it, and the way you're doing it as well. So no grief is better or bigger than another grief, and you are your own best expert on grief, because it's your journey, and each grief journey is different. I mourn my wife differently than I mourn my father, who died recently, just a few months ago. So because the relationship is different, the mourning is different. So each loss we have, we mourn it differently. We oftentimes will mourn and grieve in character. In other words, the way we were taught. So sometimes we get a chance in grief to examine how we're responding and how we want to show up, and question that, and to modify that and change that as we learn more about how to process grief. There's not an end, there's not a closure to grief. It's something that continues for, throughout our lives. And what happens is we grow and we can expand our understanding and our hearts to incorporate and integrate grief into our day-to-day life. Originally, when we experience a loss, it's a loss that takes place and we are overwhelmed. The cover's been pulled out from underneath us. Our life has changed forever in that one moment. Now we can prepare. My mother asked me, she said, well, you know a little bit about grief and grieving, and I'm just surprised why you're so upset. And I said, well, Mom, I think I did all I could do to prepare, but I never was going to ever be ready. So it's important they understand that you can prepare, but also know that after the loss, there's still the grieving and mourning to be done. It's different. Anticipatory grief, gives us the privilege and the honor of knowing ahead of time, to some extent, which of course our minds love a little bit of information about the future. But the idea is that we have an opportunity to understand the preciousness of the time left. And so being able to focus our attention on the moment and being present to what is taking place is really, it's a privilege. It's something that should be honored and respected. So the idea is that, how do we do that? So let me share with you, first of all, what grief is and what the difference is between grief and mourning. Because there's a difference between grief and mourning. Oddly enough, you might think, well, really, they're the same. I've always heard about them being the same. Well, grief is what we feel and think on the inside. Mourning is what we do with those feelings and those thoughts as we express them on the outside. So basically, mourning is grief gone public. So there's oftentimes different types of losses. Of course, in life, we lose a loved one, we lose a pet, we lose a job, we relocate, we get divorced, we separated from our family, we're estranged. There are many different types of loss in life. Those feelings that we associate with loss are oftentimes numbness, they're shock, they're this being thrown into what we call liminal space, being betwixt and between, confused, not really sure. We have physical symptoms, there's heaviness in the chest. Sleep problems are typically an issue when it comes to when we're grieving. And so they are all part of how we feel. So, but the bottom line is that the truth is that if we love, we're going to grieve. If we love and have an attachment to someone, something, a pet, because pet loss is just as legitimate as any other loss. If the love is real, the grief is real. And the love continues. I mean, just because someone died physically doesn't mean that that love doesn't continue for them and then for us. Now, that depends upon partly what you believe. But the bottom line is your heart will tell you, if you still love them and still think of them over the course of time, then the love is real. And so being able to learn how to remember them with more love than pain is what is our journey. And as we continue to grow and understand, and as those emotions and feelings soften over time, as we engage in actively remembering them versus shying away from the memories. Now, I'm not talking about traumatic memories. I'm talking about memories that come as a result of reflecting upon the life and the time we had together, what meaning they brought to our lives, the importance they played, the important role they played in our lives. As we do that, those emotions continue to soften, and as they soften, that we continue to remember them, and then we come to a point where we remember them with more love than pain. I think after loss, the most challenging thing that I experienced with Kinsella was to learn to love her in her absence. I'd never done that before. I had no idea what I was doing. I was just, after her death, I was just kind of knocking around trying to figure it all out. But I realized from another one of my mentors, David Kessler, that it was learning to love her in her absence. So we're learning a whole new skill set, both in anticipatory grief and after death grief or after loss grief. We're learning a whole different set of skills. I was taught as a young child, because we talked about death and dying on a regular basis. We traveled a great deal as a family. So my parents wanted to always make sure they knew what was going to happen if something happened to them, what would happen to my sister and I. So the topic wasn't a forbidden topic, as it sometimes is in families. But we never talked, when we talked about someone who died in the family, they said, well, we just, okay, great, let's move on. So they taught us to just kind of move on and not really process the grief. And so I had to really have come to a challenge as losses, continued in my life, to realize that that's not necessarily the truth. You can't just move on. You've got to move through. You can't move on. And so the idea is, how do we do that? And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. There's no right way to grieve. Your way is the right way. Someone saying, well, gee whiz, he hasn't really cried, or he really hasn't, he hasn't really, really expressed his emotions. He hasn't really said much about it. Well, there's a certain 30 or so percent of the people in this world are practical grievers. They understand this has happened. That's it. They don't really engage much with their feelings in the sense that, that's part of their life. They just simply, say, okay, I got it. I'll go to the next thing. And it's not necessarily that they're denying or they're pushing it back or they're stuffing it. They just are very practical about the fact that there's nothing I can do about bringing them back. So therefore, I'm going to continue to live my life. And it's not callous. It's not forgetful. It just simply is their way of doing it. The rest of us, engage in our emotions and feel those feelings. And which is not something that we as a society necessarily support. So consequently, it's important for us to understand that to give each other permission, and that we have to do this publicly because we do this with one another. I don't mean public in the sense that we're doing today, which of course you can because this is a safe place. Grief is the kind of we're in the no judgment zone, but the idea is that we have to be willing to give ourselves permission to grieve, as well as give other people in our families permission to grieve as they wish and as they believe is right for them, because each person's relationship with the person who's dying or the person who has died is going to be different. We have to honor and respect that. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. So again, grief is what we feel on the inside. Mourning is what we do with those feelings on the outside. Examples of how we do that: we're talking to others, crying, journaling, making art, writing down your thoughts, singing a song that express your feelings. All those are expressions. All those are ways that we can mourn. There are not 5 stages of grief. There are there are actually 6 stages of grief, according to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, who just wrote a book on finding meaning after loss, adding it as a 6th stage of grief. But they're not linear in any way, shape, or form, nor were they ever intended to be. The book that they wrote together on grief and grieving, in the first page of the book, they say these are not linear. These are just simply steps along the way, and you can step into each one of them within minutes of each other. So it could change by the moment, change by the day, but there are just basically points of alert to let you know this is some of the things that you may be feeling. You may be feeling anger. Anger is really is a protest emotion. It's basically the mind's attempt to say, I'm really protesting the fact that I feel helpless and fearful. And the only way that I can express that is by being angry, because I'm trying to regain control. I don't want to feel hopeless and I don't want to feel helpless. And so we get angry. And anger is another thing in grief that's not talked much about. Hopefully in the coming years it will be, because it's an important component, because we oftentimes look at it as being a very big emotion. And as a big emotion, of course, we don't want to deal with that. Those are big emotions. Those are things we don't like to necessarily deal with, when in fact they're very real. And we have to look at the fact that our emotions are basically messengers. They share with us, foretell us of things to come. And if we will engage and initiate a relationship with them, as it were, authentically, then we'll find the guidance we need in order to navigate the journey of grief, through the wilderness of grief, on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis. But it takes attention. Grief and grieving are hard work, whether it's anticipatory grief or after-death grief, after-loss grief. It's difficult work. It's fatiguing. You've got to be kind to yourself. You've got to allow yourself the space, and particularly anticipatory grief, because you're in the midst of hope, and you have this ambiguous feeling about hope, and you have this feeling that somehow that that the end is coming. And so this back and forth between those two feelings oftentimes just is exhausting, because I know that my wife, Kinsel, was just brilliant human being. She was incredible and incredibly intelligent, very insightful. And yet she did not want to talk about it. She knew full well spiritually she was understood what was going to take place, and where she was going, and how she was going to, and who was going to be there when she got there. But the idea in the meantime is because she didn't want her attention anywhere but on staying alive as long as possible. After all, she had just found someone who loved her dearly, and she didn't want to leave this life at this point in time. But, we didn't talk much about what was coming until the very, very end. I mean, the last couple of weeks, really. And so when it became apparent that there was no other alternative, there wasn't going to be any more there was an end that was in sight. And so, but that was her way of living her life fully. And so that was okay. You know, that's just part of allowing people to be where they need to be. And also allowing the fact that, you know, there's a component in this book talking about allowing, engage in and embrace the idea of allowing things that you can't understand, you don't control necessarily, but you also, allowing doesn't mean that you're giving up. It just simply means that you're honoring what's happening in the moment as it is, versus trying to manage it in a different way, but allowing it to reveal to you in that moment what it is that you need to do next. You know, that didn't work out, so now what do you do? So you've got to remain creative, and the creativity is really what that brings up in us, unless we suppress it by being angry, unless we circumvent it by being angry. So the creativity in the moment is saying, oh, I understand, this is what's happening now. I can either, and there's nothing wrong with being angry and then coming back to a point of center, you know, expressing your emotions, because emotions need motion. They need to be expressed. It's important for them to be expressed. And sometimes the baseball bat to the mattress is the right to express that anger, or going out and breaking, you know, buying some dishes at Target, cheap dishes at Target, and going in the backyard and smashing them. The bottom line is that grief, you know, and anger need to be expressed. And so it's not that you don't express it, just you come to a point of understanding that you're also giving space for you to be able to see it for what it is and respond to it in a creative way. So allowing is an important part. You also, as a griever, have a Bill of Rights, as it were. I know that sounds awfully odd, but let me show you what Dr. Wilfeld's is created around what's called a mourner's Bill of Rights. Do you see this on screen?
Not yet.
Okay, so let me go back here. I love Zoom. It only lets you share. It doesn't share within the context of that. But this is the Mourner's Bill of Rights. And what's important about this is that this, because of the society in which we live, gives you a very detailed explanation of the fact you have the right to experience your own unique grief. You have the right to talk about your grief. You have the right to feel a multitude of emotions. You have the right to be tolerant of your physical and emotional limits. I mean, these are all rights that you have. I'm going to put this in the chat box for you. And the reason this is important is because it helps us navigate grief, because we haven't necessarily had to deal with grief in the past, or a grief of the loss of a loved one, or the anticipated loss of a loved one. So this gives you some, I don't know, framework in which you can look at the experience, having not necessarily experienced it before, having any experience in this area of grief and grieving, or grief and mourning from your past. Is that helpful? You can get that. The link is in the chat box for you to download the Mourner's Bill of Rights if you would like. So that's some fundamentals about grief and mourning, and some of the aspects of how to look at it and how to kind of begin to see it from a different point of view. So now let's stop here and say questions about grief and mourning that you might have from what I've said so far, things that have come up for you that you want to dive into a little bit deeper.
So Garrick, you had made a comment that, and I'm going to say her name. Tell me your wife's name again one more time. Kinslow. Okay. You had made a comment that she didn't really want to talk about it until close to. With that, anticipating the possibility, how do you, knowing that you are the person that is going to have to say deal with it later, how you see where I'm getting this? How do you have that conversation with that person, even though they don't want to have that conversation because there are things that need to be, so to speak, in order, especially things like if they don't have the will? How do you, and you don't want to be caught without one, or I mean, some people don't care, but how do you have that? How do you broach that subject with the individual or individuals that may not want to have that conversation in a very, kind way? I mean,
yeah. Well, it's
without creating the anger. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I don't, you can't necessarily be responsible for someone else's reaction or response, but you can certainly be considerate. And the topic needs to be talked about. So it wasn't that she wouldn't be able to talk about. In other words, we knew she wanted a DNR, an out of hospital DNR. She was clear about what she wanted medically every step of the way. She made her own decisions. We assembled a team of doctors from MD Anderson all the way to locally here. And we had incredible healthcare available to her, but she made her own decisions. And so she was intimately engaged in understanding as she looked at her scans, although sometimes she would not want to look at her scans. It just depends upon her frame of mind in the moment. But in between, there's a difference between talking about your own death and talking about what you want in order to live your life fully. And that's really the context of the conversation, is like, part of it is unburdening those who are left behind. And the other part of it is, how do you live your life fully until the end? And so that's just a series of conversations that someone has to guide through, asking the questions. Mom, I need your help. I'm not sure I know what to do if this were to happen. Could you help me understand what you might like? And so you begin with these icebreakers that are outlined in the Conversations Project, Conversation Starter Kit. It's conversationproject.org. And basically, I dive into that very deeply in another series of webinars I do on the 3 Ds of advanced care planning. And I'll touch on that a little bit in 2 weeks as well, when we talk about advanced care planning and where to go to get some of these resources that'll help you have these conversations. But with Kinslow, it was more of a frame of mind that she wanted to maintain, as far as her clarity, that she didn't want to invite in a conversation where the emotions would get ahead of her. Now, she was a marriage and family therapist. She understood emotions extremely well. So she understood herself also, and she understood what she wanted around her. And so, she was very adamant about who was around her and who wasn't, in order to ensure that she was able to maintain a state of mind that was supportive of where she wanted to be in that moment. She was very much in the moment. So, but the conversation, I think that Conversation Project Starter Kit might be helpful for you to download and take a look at, because it gives you a list of like 10 or 15 icebreakers on how to begin the conversation. The most important part of this is to understand that the conversation is not one and done. It's a series of conversations. It takes place over time. And however, when you have a disease like dementia, it's oftentimes most important to have that conversation as soon as you have a diagnosis, because there is no place that's going except where they're not going to be able to articulate what they want and what they value most as time goes on. As a matter of fact, there is, as a sidebar here, there's a specific directive that you can add to your advanced directives. It's called Dementia Supplemental. And it's an addendum that you add to your living will, your directive to physician, family, or surrogates in the state of Texas, what that form is called. And it specifically outlines what you want at each stage, mild, moderate, or severe, of dementia. Now, there's 14 different stages of dementia. There's a FACT test that they apply to determine what stage you're at. But fundamentally, you break it down into 3 categories, those 3 categories, and you can, if once you receive the diagnosis, you can say, well, gee whiz, I need to decide what I want in this stage, this stage, and this stage, as a gift to my loved ones, to make sure that they're not burdened with trying to figure this out, and to burden them with guilt and shame afterwards, because afterwards there's always that, did I do the right thing question that comes up in the caregiver's mind. Absolutely. And you want to alleviate yourself of that burden by having the conversations ahead of time. So I think you just have to explore the different ways to have the conversation, but equip yourself with these icebreakers, because each one of them has a different approach to having the conversation, initiating the conversation, or deepening the conversation as time passes.
And maybe bringing the family in and saying, hey, we need to have, between sisters, and I'm speaking in general context as well as my own, but to anticipate and saying, we need to have this conversation and make sure while we still can. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that whether it's anticipatory grief or grief after loss, is that you you are verbal, that you do talk amongst yourself, amongst the family, because the harmony within the family allows people to engage in process actively and publicly. And I mean within the family, intimacy of the family and the safety of the family. And that's where obviously exercising non-judgment and allowing people to be where they need to be, angry or otherwise, as they learn to process or they learn over the course of time. And they may not be on your timeline because there is no timeline to grief. There's no reward for speed here. There's no prize at the end. It doesn't end at some point in time. You say, oh, I'm done, I'm out.
Right.
It works.
Right.
That loss, or that feeling of loss is in the memories, the love, which never dies, is always there. So any other thoughts or questions about grief in general and how grief works, how mourning is, and what mourning is about, why there's a difference? We have somebody in the chat here. Do you see what we've got here? Trying everyone. My mother actually passed away yesterday. I knew she wouldn't pick up the phone after she texted me, but I felt it was important that she knew that I could call her anytime. I left her a voice message telling her just that. She replied that she was a mess and would take a few days before she could actually talk. Sometimes it's hard to know what a person needs when they're grieving. I typically think about what I would do in their shoes, which is not necessarily the right thing to do. Very good point about that, because oftentimes we want to help and we have a desire to help. We don't necessarily know what to do when we help, but the idea is that it's very simple. She basically just shared with us what she did want, which is why she wanted to take a couple of days. It doesn't mean that you don't talk to her or try again in a couple of days, or wait for her to call you, because in confusion and in shock that people are in after an unexpected death, they're not necessarily thinking linearly. They're in liminal space. Everything's upside down. They don't know where the door is. I mean, I don't know how many times I went into a room to find my keys to my car when I had them in my hand. It's like, oh yeah, I think I'm hungry, but it's been days since I ate. Or I don't feel like getting out of bed, and I don't even know what day of the week it is. All those things are part of the shock and the confusion that takes place, particularly in early grief. And so the idea is that we listen to what the griever wants. We allow them to share with us. They're the expert. As Dr. Wilfelt would put it, is basically show up with ears open, mouth shut, and presence available. And then we'll add the fourth thing, which is allow divine momentum. Allow them to share with you what it is that they want. I really don't have words to express my sorrow for your loss, and I really don't know what to do, but I'm here by your side, and I'll listen to you. I'll be here. I'll witness your grief. And that witnessing of grief is so important that we have that in our lives, whether it's anticipatory grief or after death grief, after loss grief. Bottom line is that presence is the greatest gift we give one another. It's a safe place. I know that I can trust you if you're listening. You're not trying to tell me what you think or where your grief or your sorrow or what you're having or what, did I try acupuncture or, have you done this or have you done? You're not giving me advice. You're just simply listening, allowing me to share what I am struggling to understand. And by sharing, I might understand a little better. But I won't trust you with that. I won't be vulnerable with you unless I can see that you're going to cherish, you're going to hold precious what I'm about to say. In a space that's not judgmental. It just simply is allowing me to be where I need to be. So I think in this chat that the person who is the griever has said, I want to take a couple of days. Call them in a couple of days. Show up on their doorstep with something to eat. Call them and say, I'm going to the grocery store. What can I get for you? Be proactive. Don't burden them with, and don't burden with them trying to figure out what to say or what to do or leaving it to them. Yeah. So you can't, the other thing is that it's about also understanding that you're not broken. You don't need to be fixed. You're in grief. And these feelings are normal. What you're feeling is normal. It's normal, okay? It's part of it. And the reason that it's so in your face is because it may be not something you've gone through before or necessarily experienced in this way, in this before because the relationship is different this time. And so realize that you're not broken. You therefore do not need to be fixed. You're in grief. You're mourning the loss of someone loved. You're mourning the loss of a relationship or betrayal or any one of a number of a pet, something that, you know, is really near and dear to you. So let's talk about anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the inner experience of expected loss. Remember, grief is what we feel and think on the inside. Anticipatory grief is what we feel about an expected loss. It's also known, as I mentioned, early grief. Has two components. One is process, which is we're living through the change. For 4 years, 3 weeks, and 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks, I lived through the change of realizing that, you know, we had to spend our honeymoon in MD Anderson. We weren't going to Hawaii. We had to take the, you know, had to watch as she withered away, and she basically wasted away in the last 6 months of her life, and how sorrowful, how difficult that was, and realized that this was part of the process of acknowledging the fact that she was going to be dying, or she was in the process of dying. It's also a projection. So we have process and projection. Projection is us looking into the future. Like we talked about before, spending more time in the future with our imagination than the present. This is where we start to catastrophize. This is also where we can engage in what we call joy guilt, which is looking at what's going to happen afterwards when someone's gone and feeling guilty about that. That's going to be okay, that we're feeling some joy about the future. And so there's something to be said for being in the present. There's nothing wrong with it. It just simply is part of what you might feel or might be feeling when it comes to projection into the future. So you can either catastrophize or you can have joy guilt around the idea that you're seeing something after the fact that you feel good about, but you're in a situation where you're supposed to feel bad. And so there's conflict. So you have to resolve that. So what's the difference between anticipatory grief and regular grief? So obviously regular grief is what we would normally feel after a significant loss is final, and something that you'll also engage in and be experiencing as you come to after the death of your loved one. Anticipatory grief is what we were feeling inside during the process of change. They're similar, but they're not the same. And oddly enough, that's true. I thought, well, you know, how's that possible? So dealing with anticipatory grief and having gone through that, it's true. It's different. You know, anticipatory grief typically begins with a period of change and can be very chaotic and unpredictable. We don't have to live in this we don't like to live in this kind of uncertainty. It's uncomfortable. It's disorienting. We experience heightened emotions because we become very protective and torn or ambivalent, wishing that we're over. Can't we just get through this? And those people are your fixers are like, let's just get it done. Let's just fix it. Let's just get beyond it. Let's move past it. We also experience joy guilt, as I mentioned. And then there's the fourth one, which is we in this liminal space, spending time, the in-between time, which is the during. Normally there's a before and an after. With anticipatory grief, there is a very significant part of grieving that we do in between, or the what we call the in-between time or the during time. And so, but it's also an opportunity to spend time with a loved one, precious time, and also to take care of unfinished business along the way. So the difference between anticipatory grief and regular grief are those things that I just mentioned. Any questions or thoughts about that, or some of your experiences you may have with how anticipatory grief is working right now for you in your life? Okay.
Just real briefly, this is hitting me right on the head today.
Is it helpful?
I experienced grief 24 years ago when my youngest son committed suicide. I didn't know it was going to happen, so I didn't get to plan for it. I'm a fixer. So now dealing with my husband's Parkinson's, we're planning. We're able to do that. So I can really see the difference between the regular grief and anticipatory, two totally different things that I never dreamed that I'd be going through or get to experience.
Mhm. Mhm. And when you say you're planning, what are the things that you're doing, you're actively involved in conversation about?
Well, we're talking about the future. You know, we've got to make plans. We've got to have something lined out for ourselves and our you know, our future,
Mhm.
because we don't know how long it's going to be. When my son committed suicide, it was right there. It stopped.
It's stop abrupt.
We couldn't plan anything. We planned his funeral. We planned his what to do with these things. So that in that sense, things are that way, but different, like you said.
Yeah, like this, and the odd thing is, it looks, you know, to say it's a privilege to know in advance is, you know, it's good, but it's also like, I don't want that privilege. Thank you very much.
Exactly.
I wish I didn't have that privilege, you know. It's like coming to a grief group, says, glad you're here, but really sorry you're here.
Yeah.
Same idea.
Yeah.
So there's 6 needs in mourning, particularly anticipatory grief. Acknowledge the reality of your grief and the pending loss. It's number 1, which is day by day and bit by bit, learning to say hello before you can say goodbye. Hello to and accepting the fact that the loss is pending, that this loss is coming. And so that was the conversation I had with my mother, is that, yeah, I can be prepared. So we've had the conversations and I understand what's happening. I can see it.
Mhm.
At the same time, when it happened, in that moment in time, it wasn't ready. You never seem to, and I've talked to many people about that. It's like, well, no, you just never can be ready, but you can be prepared as much as you can, but you can't be ready. You're never ready. Number 2 is embrace both the pain and the joy of your advanced or your anticipatory grief. Naming and expressing your feelings softens them. Oftentimes people feel as avoid, you know, let's avoid these big emotions. Well, they're big emotions because they're inviting us to engage with them, to have the dance, to actually think about these things, feel these things, because emotions need motion. You've got to feel it to heal it. So, I mean, it's really important that they are honored and respected for what they are, not just cast aside or stuffed away, because I'll guarantee you, if you want to place your grief on hold, no problem. It'll be there until you're ready, and when you're ready to deal with it in the future, because it doesn't go away. It may come out in different types of behavior, you know, where you're eating a lot, weight loss, you know, aberrant behavior of different types. And people may not understand why the relationship was sabotaged because this has been stuffed away. But the idea is that you can delay your grief if you want, but it'll always be there, and will continue to remind you that it's present in many different ways if you're not willing to look at it directly. So the idea is, this second of the 6 needs of mourning is to embrace both the pain and the joy. And the joy being to be able to see them for what they are, and the fact, or basically as you see them for what they are, is this, you're able to see them from the different facets of the way you love them. Number 3 is explore the memories associated with love or attachment you're losing. Remembering those things helps us make sense of our lives. Number 4 is develop a new identity, because the new identity is in the process of emerging. On February 12th, 4:35 Central Time, 2019, I no longer was a husband. I no longer was a caregiver. I no longer was a patient advocate. I had no idea who I was. So that had to be reconstructed. I had to figure out what that looked like going forward. Basically answering the question, who will I be after the loss? Number 5 is search for meaning. And meaning doesn't mean that you find meaning in the death, you find meaning in the person. The impact they had on your life, the value that they brought to you. There's so many traits and characteristics that my wife exemplified and lived that remain and will continue to fuel and inspire me for the rest of my life. That as I do those things, I'm honoring her as I develop those qualities within myself. And so I find meaning in doing this work as a result of those things that mattered most to us and to me, in our relationship, and what she showed me was possible. So number 6 is to reach out and accept support from others. Good one, tough one, particularly for fixers like me. Reaching out to talk to somebody about this stuff? Are you kidding? Not a chance. So that was a big one, because, you know, I'm a type A personality, hard driving, corporate guy, just made things happen. And to be vulnerable in any way, shape, or form with anybody? Are you kidding? No, not going to happen. But I learned that it's important to do, because it winds up being what fuels your ability to heal. Being able to share, be able to hear. And you can, when you hear stories from other people, you also are learning from them that things you didn't know about yourself, you see yourself in other people. And that's what being able to witness someone's grief actually does. It not only validates who they are, but also gives them a safe place to express, but also gives you, as a gift, an opportunity to see yourself. And so that's the invaluable gift that you can receive from being in a group and being able to share. So the idea next is how it is that we live and love and mourn at the same time. Practice mindfulness, be present, be here, be now. Take the time, the precious time you have with that person, and be with them, love them, care for them. Have the arguments you always wanted to have the discussions you always wanted to have, take care of your unfinished business, resolve the things between you that prevent you from loving each other more deeply. Mend the hurt that you may have created or caused, and forgive if you've done that to others. Forgive yourself and forgive them. Set your intention for the day. What's my intention for today? So that helps you keep present with what it is you need to do versus future project or catastrophize. And then really do embrace allowing yourself to let the day be the day. And if things don't work out today, realize that don't let your mind step in and try and control things, because this is not a situation you're going to control. This is a situation that's evolving under its own steam. Better to allow yourself to see and to make yourself aware of, by being present, what the rhythm of this is versus trying to swim upriver. That's where the resistance is. That's where the great deal of pain is. And that's absolutely where suffering is. It's in the resistance to what is. So embrace allowing. Give yourself a chance to learn from what's happening right now in this moment, not trying to frame it, not trying to control it. Thoughts? We have just a couple more minutes, but thoughts or comments you'd like to make or share as we come to a close here?
I love that you said create intention for the day.
Yes.
I think that that's important, obviously before and after, losing someone. And I think that's very helpful. And also giving yourself grace.
Yes.
So if the day doesn't go out as planned, or I have a lot of families that tell me, they lost their patience with their loved one, and that they're getting down on themselves about it. And how dare I do that to them when they're going to die in 6 months? And I try to remind people that, you're human, we're human. This is a human process, and to give yourself grace, because the truth is tomorrow is a new day, and it's a way for you to open the next chapter each day. So I really liked what you shared.
Thank you, Jennifer. They make a really good point. And the thing, even you can bring it to the moment too, where you're saying, listen, did you do your best? Or were you doing your best? Did you have their best interest in heart? Okay, let's be with that for a moment, and then go forward into this next moment with that understanding that your heart is in the right place, and that you may want to adjust how you respond, but ultimately you're doing this from your heart and for the right reason.
Exactly.
So you can shift it from moment to moment. There's 2 questions you can ask yourself anytime you feel that you're in expectation versus intention, and that is, what do I have to learn? What do I have to give? Each moment gives an opportunity for both. It's an equation, and it's a 50-50 equation. You give and you receive. There's not just giving. When we give too much, we burn out because we're out of balance.
It's true. And you talked about mindfulness and the importance of that. And sometimes that's mindfulness in the middle of the chaos.
Exactly.
It's giving yourself permission to say, hey, I need a moment, and being open with that person. I see some smiles going, it's true.
Yeah, very true.
It's very true.
I learned a thing actually before my mother's stuff, and I just do it in general, just of life. If it's the dishwasher or whatever, just whatever the chaos or the mess. But the 4x4x4 is, breathe in for 4, hold it for 4, and release for 4, and just taking a moment to breathe. There have been several times where I have, as Jennifer said, and you've said, give yourself the grace. And there's been times where I've said, excuse me, I'm going to step in the other room a minute. And I go in and I grab a pillow and I scream into the pillow. And then I go back in and I say, okay, Mom, what would you like for dinner? I'm sorry, you said you wanted pizza. We don't have pizza today. Those sort of things, because you have to give yourself that moment to have your moment.
Yeah.
To go, and they can't see you, but that's okay, because, it's the anger part of the anticipating. I have, the grief of it. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Thank God she's got big pillows too in her couch.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. Yeah. Anyway.
Was this helpful? Did you find this worthwhile? And did we answer all your questions? What you wanted to learn today?
Yes, it was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Is there anything?
Garrett, could you put your email, or not your email, could you put your, you had in the thing, could you put that in the chat box, that if they had any questions, maybe they could reach out to you? Would that be?
Sure.
And also the conversation starters here.
Oh, yes, very helpful. Conversation starters, yes. And that actually, Garrick, you said that was going to be something you would do on the 29th, correct?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The conversation starter kits you're talking about, and there's a number of them. So let me get the.
I feel like I saw it somewhere before once, like
on the kitchen table conversations website.
Yep, it's on the conversation. It's on the website, as well as it's also right here in this link I just put in the chat box.
That way I just can click and have it open.
You just click and open it.
And I can bookmark them or whatever.
There's a ton of different ones in there, different types of starter kits, multiple languages. It's a brilliant project. I've worked with them closely in the last 4 years, and they're just wonderful organization. I use their material quite a bit because it is so well done. So in the conversation starter kit, you actually inside page 8 or 9, somewhere in there. Anyway, the books have been redone recently. They've changed them up and improved them. There is a list of conversation starters, icebreakers, basically they call them. And so we do it. We'll do a little bit of review of that in 2 weeks, and then I do an in-depth 3-part series on the 3 Ds of advanced care planning: how to decide, discuss, and document your end-of-life wishes in August, which is sponsored by AARP. And that's an hour and a half of diving into the deciding what it is that you want at the end of your life, and also deciding who's going to speak for you if you're not able to speak for yourself. And the second one is on, how do you have the discussion with your loved ones, and most importantly, your loved ones and your healthcare team, all your doctors and nurses, and how you had that conversation with them. And then third, of course, is how you document this so that it is in the statutory documents of the state of Texas, so that everyone's on the same page, basically developing your roadmap for healthcare at the end of your life.
Where will we obtain the information on the August ones if it is through AARP?
It'll be on the conversation, or excuse me, it's on the Kitchen Table Conversations website.
Already posted? Okay,
I'll have the link on there for registration by Saturday,
okay. Thank you.
and it's free.
Sure, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I just wanted to know if we're interested in to mark the dates.
Yep. I'll have the details and the registration link for you in 2 weeks as well. So when we talk about it, I'll give you a preview and introduction to the 3-part series.
Okay.
About advanced care plan. I think it's at this same time in 2 weeks.
Yes, it is on the 29th. Yes, it will be.
We'll spend
And
an
the
hour,
link.
yeah.
Huh?
We'll spend an hour talking about advanced care planning and how to go about it, what the 3Ds are, and some of the details around it.
Well, Garrick,
Absolutely.
thank you so much on behalf of the Capital Area Parkinson's Organization. We are so grateful that you're here and all of the families that are here as well, caring for people. So I wish everybody a wonderful day. Please feel free to reach out to Garrick directly. You could always call CAPS, and we appreciate all of you being here.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.